Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today I am honored to have Nigel Barker with me. Nigel has a phenomenal story and very fascinating. I'm super excited to highlight all the things that he's been able to do and where he's at. Probably most infamously known for his modeling, photography, and then helping host and judge on the TV show America's Next Top Model. So Nigel, thanks so much for being on today.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
You betcha. So if I didn't start at this point in the story, I feel like I would miss something. But your mom won a crown for a title. So talk a little bit about having a mom that had some exposure there, and maybe what that impacted you with growing up.
So my mum won Miss Sri Lanka back in, I think, 1967 or around that time period. And actually, funnily enough, had the crown then taken away from her because she wasn't 100% Sri Lankan. And back then in the Miss World competition, you had to be 100% from the country. And my grandfather was English and Portuguese, and my grandmother was Sri Lankan. So she didn't qualify, it turned out, after the fact. And they didn't know this, they didn't do the due diligence beforehand. So she did the whole competition, won, and they had it taken away several days later. But it was, in a lot of people's eyes, that was, she was the winner at that point. Yeah, but she would then move to the UK from Sri Lanka, in large part because she was so upset about what had just happened, with my grandmother and my aunt, and became a model in the 60s and early 70s, a singer, an actress, and really helped shape, that side of my family and look after them and put food on the table and really worked incredibly hard, to be honest with you. It was very difficult working in the sort of early 70s, late 60s as a woman of color from Sri Lanka. In the modeling industry, there were very few jobs. It was very stereotyped. But I kind of grew up with this woman who was very hardworking. My grandmother lived in the house with us. My aunt lived in the house with us for many years too. And I got to see how these women interacted with one another. I saw how hard they worked. I saw my grandmother was an incredibly accomplished woman herself, but when she came to England, basically had to start from scratch because no one would hire her because she was from Sri Lanka, and unless they were going to give her a secretarial job, and she'd had executive jobs as a woman in the country of Sri Lanka. And so it was, I grew up with these sort of powerful women in my life, and that sort of helped shape my life. And it also kind of made me see a different side of the modeling industry. It made me realize that although it was, glitzy and glamorous, it could also be, a ways to a means. And so I realized just for them, it was it got them out of their country. It moved them to another part of the world. She met my father and all this sort of stuff. And so obviously when the opportunity came along for me later on, that was something that I thought, let me just try this. Let me just see what this is like. And it wasn't that I necessarily wanted to be a model or anything.
Yeah. So kind of parlaying right into that, you're thinking, hey, I'm going to go to, university, or I'm going to go to school. And your mom says, well, maybe I'll put your name into a show and we'll see what comes from it. So talk a little bit about that show and the ending result that came from that.
Well, it's funny because I was actually just talking to my mother over the weekend, and she brought it up again to my children, her grandchildren, and said, it's funny, when your father was 17, 18 years old, unbeknownst to him, I entered him into a modeling competition because she used to love this show called The Clothes Show. And she'd heard that they were running a modeling competition, and she said that she ran she entered this photograph in, and they said, yes, please have him come along. Apparently I showed up there. I remember showing up actually, and they had me walk one time, and they pretty much said, you're in the show. And so I was like, wow, okay, that's cool. To be honest, was when you're a kid that age, you take a lot for granted. You don't realize the process, or whether you were lucky or not lucky necessarily. You don't often appreciate everything at the time. Obviously ironic because I went on to become a judge of America's Next Top Model, but at that particular time, I actually got my own break from a televised modeling search in the UK in the late 80s, and it was kind of pivotal for me because I was meant to be going to medical school. I was studying biology, chemistry, physics, and math, and had done for 3 years already. And I was all of a sudden thought, well, okay, instead of trying to do a military scholarship, which I was trying to do, like a naval scholarship to actually study medicine, so I could, pay my way through, which would have been 7 years plus 3 years or 4 years in the service after the fact, which was like an 11-year sort of, ahead of me.
Yeah.
I perhaps thought, well, if I do some modeling, if I make some money, then maybe I can pay my own way and I don't have to do that, which, although I didn't necessarily, wasn't against going into the Navy, because I come from a military background. My father and my grandfather are both in the Navy.
Okay.
That I potentially could, pay my own way and do, and do what I want and see the world a little bit, because I'd lived a pretty parochial life up until then. I'd been at a boarding school. I didn't really have a great grasp of the world necessarily, and I thought, well, this would help shape me a little bit and make my eyes be a little wider. And I did 1 year modeling, and it went very well.
Yeah.
So my parents and I agreed, well, because legally in England, when I say legally, it's sort of officially, rather, probably is a better word. You're able to do 2-year gap year sabbatical before going back to college. And so I thought, I'll take that second year. And I did well again, second year. And then my parents said, okay, it's time to go back to school. And I remember literally sort of having this big sort of showdown with them where I'm like, you know what, I don't want to go. And they were like, well, you have to, it's time. And I'm like, well, I don't want to go. And I can continue doing this. And they were like, no, you can't continue doing that. It's not a job. And you have to go and do, become a real job, to become a doctor and get a real job and all the rest of it. And I just sort of thought, wow, I'd had a taste of modeling. And that's why I always say, parents, beware what you let your kids do. Because I had, really enjoyed this past 2 years. I've got to travel the world. I was meeting, wonderful, extraordinary people, beautiful people too. And as a young man, you are sort of starry-eyed about it all. Getting to dress in cool clothes, getting to go to great parties that I've never would have been invited to otherwise, and make good money doing it all. And you were sort of living this glamorous life, which is very tempting at that age. And I sort of thought, well, no, I want to stay doing this. I don't really want to go and listen to people's ailments. Actually, it's not really sounding that good.
Right.
And my parents sort of said, well, kind of thing, we're going to cut you off a little bit. And I was, thought, well, okay, I can manage, because I've actually made some money. So I kind of went off on my own, and I moved to Italy, and I started living in Italy for the next couple of years. And that really was a big change in my whole life and my career as I sort of started to model.
Yeah. So I want to dive into that a little bit. I think for a lot of people, it's really difficult for them to make decisions when, I would say, key people in their life don't agree with the decision they're about to make. So, for you, obviously you had some success, in the modeling industry, and you're kind of going against the wishes of, probably two relatively key people in your life at that time. So how did you have the confidence to make that choice?
It's a lot of it is just, if I look back before then, I had never really wanted to study medicine. I had never really wanted to particularly study science.
Yeah.
I suffered from the fact that I was neither great or bad at anything. I was sort of good at everything.
Yeah.
So what that means, without trying to blow my own horn here, is that when I was at school, my grades were pretty consistently good across the board.
Yeah.
They weren't great. I wasn't the top student, but I wasn't the middle student, but I was a sort of 3/4 up the way student all the way across in all subjects, which meant that it was quite hard, because in England, the system is that you study everything up until you're 16. And then at 16, you have to actually specialize and pick 3 or 4, if you're sort of lucky or smart enough to do it, 4 subjects. And then you specialize. And so you're already halfway along to go to college, because then once you specialize, there's only so much you can do. And up until when I was 16, what I had wanted to do was actually become a lawyer, or study English literature, and I was a Latin scholar, so I used to do Latin and ancient Greek, Tacitus, and all that kind of stuff, and I loved art history, so it was all actually in the arts. And so what happened is that I got my grades back, and my father looked at all my grades, and my father said, well, we don't have a doctor in the family. We already got someone doing accounting. We got someone doing insurance. We got the finance guy. We've got somebody who's doing art and and he said, but we don't have anyone who's a doctor. You have good grades in the sciences. You should become a doctor. And I remember that summer, and I remember when he said it, I was having such a great summer, and I was on vacation.
Yeah.
I literally just went, yeah, sure. And I didn't want to talk about it. So yeah, sure, that sounds good. And I didn't think about my life as a kid doesn't. The kid doesn't think about like the next 24 hours maybe, but I wasn't thinking about the next 24 years.
Yeah.
So it was, and I so with that in mind, I think finally when I got the opportunity and I realized that this world that I had never seen before, it was like a Pandora's box of like, wow, how look at this crazy world that's out there that I had no idea of. I've been at a boarding school all my life. So it was that gut reaction that I sort of thought, well, perhaps it's time that I took charge of my own direction in life.
Yeah.
And when I was told that I needed or had to go back, and I realized that there was an option, and because I had a bit of money in my pocket, and because I was now hanging out with adults,
yeah,
I wasn't, I was being treated like an adult because sometimes I would be out with people who were much older than me. I remember going to New York for the very first time in 1991, and I must have been 18, maybe just 19, I think 18, 19 years old. And, I was living at the Chelsea Hotel in Manhattan, which was a crazy place at the time. And I remember I was asked to go to dinner, and I went to dinner, and I was at a table with 5 people, and 2 of which were Diana Ross and Robert De Niro.
Wow.
And it was just me and my agent and some other person who I can't remember who they were anymore. But it was a sort of and I kind of remember thinking, like, wow, like,
yeah,
this is really cool. And but don't forget, this was 30 years ago, right? So at the same time, they weren't necessarily icons necessarily at that point, but they were big, well-known acting actors and rock stars, if you like, in their time, in that moment.
Yes.
And so, but it was still this sort of moment. I'm like, okay, I have this weird life right now. Do I do this, or do I go back and roll the dice on what it could be?
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Now, as you're getting into, the modeling, I think you probably gain confidence with each and every shoot and, each and every opportunity, but is there 1 or 2 of them that really stand out to you in the early years that you're like, okay, I'm good at this, and was a bigger confidence boost than maybe some of the others?
I mean, there were certainly jobs where you were like, okay, this is a really cool job, or I can't believe I got cast for this. But there was also far more, from my perspective, of sort of imposter syndrome. Most of the time, I actually felt that I shouldn't be doing this, and that I probably wasn't worthy, and that the clock was ticking, and that I wasn't going to be in vogue very long, and that this was, and I wasn't ripped enough. I was too tall, or I was too big, because I'm 6'4" and I'm a big guy. I played rugby, and actually, that worked for a period of time when I first started modeling, because I was, modeled in the late 80s, early 90s. But then come sort of 93, 94, 95, for anyone who's familiar with the fashion industry, the world of heroin chic, as if heroin could ever be chic, but heroin chic, androgyny, this whole waif model kind of vibe came along. And there was nothing I could do to make myself short, small, or androgynous. So I just was like, what am I going to do? But I still loved the industry. So I felt like, this isn't really kind of working for me. And I was trying to be perhaps something that I wasn't, and I was not really fulfilled. But there were jobs that, to your point, for example, I remember one job where I got booked in Paris to do Chanel, and we got to do a show as well. And I was one of only 4 men and sort of 25 women, and the women were legends. I mean, they were, Claudia Schiffer, Christy Turlington, Naomi Campbell, Cindy Crawford, Nadia Orman, Megan Douglas. I mean, the list goes on and on. It was literally a who's who. And I was asked to carry Naomi Campbell on my shoulders for this thing by Karl Lagerfeld, and I was just like, what is happening here? This is like, am I really in this room with these people? And I kept sort of thinking, pinch yourself, like, this isn't real. You're not one of them.
Wow.
You're on the and I also sort of thought, well, there isn't really a lifespan here at this job. So once I got sort of 6 years into it, I thought, well, I spent a really long time doing this. I've done really well. I've traveled the world. And by this time, I had met my wife, Chrissy, who was not my wife; she was my girlfriend. And she was doing very well. Vogue covers, Vogue, Italian Vogue, and all this great stuff. And and I was sort of chasing her around the world. And I thought, well, if I'm going to continue modeling, that's not going to work because it takes me in too many different directions. Also, it's not a long-term thing. And also, how do I keep this girl? Because I need to be successful. She's not going to stay with me if I'm some sort of two-bit model that's not really that successful. I need to get myself a real job, or I need to get myself a job that I can start to really make something for myself a life. So that was a part of as I moved into the other side of the camera, I thought, well, let's not throw away the 7-8 years I have under my belt, all the people I've met, the contacts I've met, and maybe I can translate it into another thing within this industry. And something I didn't say about my schooling before was that when I was doing the sciences, in order to keep myself in my art world that I love so much, I took on as a side class, I took pattern cutting, dressmaking, tailoring, weaving, and I was actually making clothes. And through my brother, who had a business at the time, I was able to sell clothes on the high street in England.
Wow.
And make money out of it. And I actually designed a hat, and I had T-shirts and stuff like that. So very similar to what my son personally is doing these days himself. But it was, it's funny. But I always had an interest in fashion. So and I had a creative edge to me, and I was taking pictures at school as well. So I kind of decided to kind of get back into my creative side and become a photographer. And that's what I did in the mid-90s.
So before we jump into being in photography, I want to hit on that idea of the imposter syndrome, because I think that, most people listening are not going to be, a gorgeous human being like yourself that's, been on the cover of Vogues and things like that. But everyone can relate to that to some degree, right? You are getting even outside affirmations, but yet you still internally don't necessarily feel like you're worthy or you're, at that level. So how for you were you able to continue to show up, shoot after shoot, even though internally you were having some of those kind of wars, if you will?
Well, I think that, at the end of the day, I grew up with a strong family around me, and I was confident in who I was.
Yeah.
But I'm also keenly aware of being realistic, and that doesn't mean that I'm pessimistic.
Yeah. Right.
But I am a realist. I'm a sort of optimistic realist in life. As in I look at the upside, but then I look at what I'm seriously capable of. Yeah. And if you're sitting there at a bench press, and you slap on 45s from either side, and you can do it, but then you see the guy next to you, and he's got sort of another 3 45s on each one, and you're like, oh, God damn it, I want to do that too. The reality is, it's just not going to happen. At least not today.
Yes.
It doesn't mean it may never happen, but it's not going to happen today. And you can have dreams, but you have to find your way there. And likewise, in this industry, I knew that I had dreams of wanting to stay in the business, and that I wanted to work with and be with my wife, who was a successful model, and I didn't want to throw it away. So it was like, well, what can I do within this business that would fulfill that same world? And in many ways, certainly jumping ahead here, going on to top model and creating television shows, I was able to sort of do both. I was able to both be on TV, so in front of the camera, but work the camera, taking pictures for the camera. So it was both things that I knew how to do. It was like this new career of mine being a photographer, and then my old career of being a model. So you're all of a sudden on stage, on set, looking at camera, talking to camera, but then you're taking pictures and showing people what you're doing. So it was both things coming together. So it's sort of, one of the things when by doing that, and by, I guess too, there's a truth to, in order to become an expert at anything, it takes 10,000 hours. Yeah. There's that expression. So, when you first start doing something, it's not that you're an imposter, but if you get very quick success, you sort of are an imposter. Yeah. You actually don't know what you're doing. And just because you're good or you're lucky or you know the right people or whatever it might be, you still have stuff to learn. And one goes on in life learning that more and more, right? That the older you get, the more you realize the less you know, that type of thing. But then you get over it and you realize that and you're okay with that, and it becomes a good thing and you become excited by that. But when you're young, you sort of can be crippled by the concept that you know so little, or you think you know everything, and and that gets in the way too. But I was always one on a big learning curve, and I remember just sort of thinking, I want to know more, I want to learn more, I want to get, and I felt like I'd done as much as I could in modeling. And I was never necessarily the most coordinated. I was necessarily the best dancer. I was never the best, had the best rhythm, things that are useful in modeling. And so you're sort of like, well, I can't do that necessarily very well. I could try, I could struggle, or people, they might just like me, but I don't want to be, cast second. I want to be cast first. And I want to be the best. And I want to be and I want to be successful. I want to be actually super successful. I want to really do that. And I want to do all these different things. I want to write books. I want to do whatever I want to do. I want to do it. And I sort of want to, so how do I go along making that happen? And I got to set a course, and I got to think about that. And I got to be a little bit out of the, what's happening in the next 24 hours and what's happening in the next 24 years. And what does that look like? And so that started to kick in my sort of mid-20s, basically.
That's great. So to your point, you transitioned from being the model to being on the photography side. So you had made a lot of connections, but how did you parlay the connections into making that a sustainable business for you?
Well, I mean, first of all, as a young photographer, really at the very first stages, I literally met my wife in Milan in '94, and that day I met her, I had a camera which I'd bought, and I had it in my room, and I said, "Oh, do you mind if I take some pictures of you?" And she was like, "Oh, sure." Like kind of, that was cute. And I remember putting her up against the wall in Milan, and the light was there, and I took some shots of her, and was excited by them, and I thought, God, this is so fun to do this. I've not really, and she was literally one of the very first people I photographed that in a way that I felt like I could do this. And I kind of thought, this is something. And I was living, and it's funny, if you ever seen Melrose Place, where everyone lives around that sort of square and they're all in that building, that's how it was like in Milan. And all the people in the building were models, every single person, and they were like literally 100 of them. Wow. 100 models in this building, and all living around the courtyard, all from all over the world. Common language was English, although there were several other languages going on. But that was the common language. And I was around them all, and when they started seeing that I was taking pictures, other models, because models are always, especially young models who are starting up, are always desperate for new pictures, new headshots, new work, and they need to show what they can do. And so I started taking pictures of everyone in this building, and I suddenly realized too, as people would come back from jobs that they were getting that day, they were coming back, and they would have, because you'd have a professional person do your hair, if as a female model, and then you'd have a professional person do your makeup. So they would come back looking amazing with hair and makeup done by the world's top people, for the cover of a magazine type of thing. And I would say, look, to everyone, I put a word out: before you wash your face, before you go and take a shower, come see me, knock on the door, send me a message. And by the way, this is pre-cell phones. So that's how old I am. It was pre-cell phones, and they weren't just running me. They had to sort of call me on a payphone, and I'd have to pick it up or something. And literally show up and knock on the door. Mid-90s, and I'm like, and let me take some pictures of you, and I'll give them to you. I'll just give them to you, and you'll get some great stuff. Because a lot of times when models do jobs, they don't actually get to see the pictures, or when they see the pictures, they don't like them because they didn't pick the ones that they liked or were good at for them. So by doing this, they were sort of guaranteed to get some pictures. Also, if you shoot a job in Milan and then you have to go back to New York, you may never see them, because back then there was no internet either. So you have to get the magazine. So you have to go to the shop and pick up the magazine, and you relied on your agency sending it to you by air, and it would arrive. So you're talking months and months and months later to actually finally see the picture, versus if I took the picture, you might see it tomorrow. So it's sort of like, wow, this is super cool. So I built my portfolio by using my contacts, by using all these models that are around me. And then I decided to do that all around the world. I followed my wife, and I started charging. So originally I started charging people just for the rolls of film, because I used to shoot film back then. Then once that became good, I started charging people sort of $50 for a roll and the roll of film. Then it was 100. And then, what happened was the agencies themselves said, God, we really like these pictures you're shooting for all these models. Can we hire you to become the agency test photographer.
Yeah.
And what happens, I moved to New York and I became the official test photographer for several agencies, including Wilhelmina, Click Models, Ford Models, and eventually Click Model Management hired me to shoot their entire agency in this one book. And that was a sort of pivotal moment because it got a lot of attention, and that book was sent out by that agency to every client in the world, and a lot of people were like, wow, this is a really cool thing that you guys did. And because the entire book was consistent, when we named it Click Silver, they put on a big exhibition of my pictures for the agency to promote the agency, but also I took all the shots, so there was a lot of clients there. That's all the people who were booking the models came to this party, and they were like, well, who shot it? It was me. And I ended up getting all these jobs. So it was a sort of a pivotal moment.
Yes. So something that was interesting to me, probably someone you would know, Peter Hurley. I had him on the show, and he talked about, you would think that going from being the model to being the photographer would be a pretty easy transition, but he goes, it's a whole different world. It's like playing offense versus defense in sports. It's like, yeah, you understand it, but it's different. But he said that one of the things that made him get better at it was the fact that he understood being on the other side of the camera, right? So he knew how to make the environment fun. And something that was interesting that I learned from you was, you think about not only what are you seeing, but what's the person that's getting the photo taken seeing, right? Are they looking at a crappy brick wall behind them? Are they looking at 19 people staring at them? So talk a little bit about how you make the environment fun, because definitely that parlays into what you're able to capture within the people you're
No, without a doubt. And yes, I mean, I know Peter. We've met each other a few times over the years. He's not someone who I come across that often, but I know of him. I know how he's been very successful in what he does, and I know that he's former model and all the rest of it. And he's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that you realize is that because you were a model, you sympathize with their position in the picture, and so that makes you very popular with the models, because you kind of understand where they're coming from. So if for example I'm shooting a model and it's freezing cold and you're asking her to wear very little, I will often take off my jacket too and just be wearing my t-shirt to be in the cold element myself, because if I can't handle it, then how can they? And so it's sort of it just to be kind of, not to be ridiculous, but to a point where obviously I wouldn't put on a swimsuit if they're wearing a swimsuit necessarily, but it's sort of like there's an element of like, understand what you're dealing with, so that you can because if you do, then that person realizes it, and then they're going to give you more of themselves. They're going to be more volunteering of their full attention and of their full emotion and everything. And and everyone, fashion photographers are different in how they deal with their subjects and how they provoke reaction out of their subjects. And certainly I've learned a lot from a lot of great photographers like Avedon, and people who, Avedon's well known for a lot of his white walled shots and very simple backgrounds and what have you. But that's not because he was necessarily shooting in a studio or he wanted it to be really simple. He wanted the background to be simple, but he would often erect the white wall directly in the environment of the person he's photographing. So if it was a farm worker, if you ever saw the behind the scenes of some of his shots, like in the West and what have you, he literally erected a white wall in the middle of in the farmland in the field of hay. So the farmer will be looking out at a field that he's so used to seeing, yet he was looking at a white, as he was shooting it, he was looking at a white wall that was behind him. So it looked like a photo studio. So it's a kind of brilliant way of making something look very sterile in a studio environment type of vibe, that you would get, that looks very portrait, but the person actually standing in there, who would, if you put him in a studio, would feel like a fish out of water and not be chill and relaxed. Instead, is looking at exactly what they always look at every day, which is the field, the whatever it might be, and that was pretty smart of him to do that. So I've often used those sorts of things, but that's if you're shooting real people. If you're shooting models and stuff, that's also part of the course, is that they're going to have people fussing over them, and they're going to, and sometimes people like that. Sometimes people like a circus. They want to have all kinds of people running around them and making a big fuss, and they want to perform, and they want to perform for an audience. And if there's no audience, then they don't want to perform, then it's gone. But some people like very intimate settings, and sometimes when it's just you and the subject, then they feel secure and they let their guard down, and you get more out of it.
Absolutely. So as we transition in, there's this show that's starting, America's Next Top Model, and you I would love to say from day one when you showed up, you're like, oh, this could be a, multi-season, over a decade long or over 10 season thing. But you had one episode and then you had to wait for a callback. So talk a little bit about how that came to be and the process of getting
So actually, it's
ingrained
it's
in
a
it.
little different than that,
Yeah.
the
Okay.
actual process. So first of all, I was never a part of season one. So season one came and went, and I watched it like many people in the fashion industry and thought it was fascinating, hilarious, brilliant. And I happened to know a few of the people that were in it, and I had come across Tyra before, but I knew Jay Manuel and I knew a guy called Nole Marin,
Yeah.
who I'd been working with quite a lot as a stylist. And when they were shooting season two, I got the call from Nole saying they're looking for photographers for season two. You should put your book up. It would be fun. And go and see the producers. They're doing a casting at Jay's house. Go by and just chat and see them, and see if they'll book you for one of the episodes. And I went and did that, and I didn't hear back for quite a while, actually, like 6 weeks. And I thought, oh well, that didn't pan out, but it was worth a try, and that would have been fun. But I never thought I was going to get on television, on a show like that. It was a sort of fun, super successful kind of show already, even though it was a small show on UPN, a network that doesn't exist anymore. But I was like, okay, this is kind of a bit of fun. And then I got a call out of the blue, and one of my assistants at the time said, "Nigel, there's a phone for you. I think it's those producers from that show you were looking at." And I was like, really? Wow. And I picked up the phone. They were like, listen, so sorry we're taking so long to get back to you. But the reason being is that we had really liked your interview, and it kept going up the ranks, up the ranks, up the ranks. And, whereas we wanted you for one episode, the people at the network and we as well, we're really considering you as a permanent fixture on the show, as a permanent judge throughout the whole season.
Yeah.
And they were like, would you entertain that? And I was like, wow. That's certainly more than I was bargaining for. And I'm like, I'm not sure that I can even clear my schedule because I've got other commitments. And when is this? And what are you talking about? And what is it going to mean? And what is that? How many days a week? And where are we going to be? And, all those things. And actually, I also thought, because I kind of knew that, because, a few people had said to me, and certainly in the industry, there were a lot of people who were sort of, not necessarily 100% behind a TV show like America's Next Top Model.
Yeah.
Certainly in the high ends of fashion, because they take themselves very seriously. It's an art form. It's very highly guarded secrets about what we do at these fancy magazines and these fancy couture houses and all the rest of it. And perhaps a show like Top Model might be too commercial and a bit of a sellout. So it was something I had to really think about and be like, this is something I want to do, because I'd been very lucky and I had a good run so far, and I'd done some pretty cool work. I was kind of on the right trajectory for doing some really great stuff. And at the same time, I thought, wow, I could feel there was a shift in the world. I could tell that things were just moving in a different way. I knew that reality television had been very successful in the UK. It was really just emerging in the US at the time, but in the UK, it had been around for 2-3 years already. And shows like sort of Ibiza Uncut and weird shows like this, which showed the behind the scenes of things about islands and what have you, had been crazy successful. And I thought, well, the world's changing. I think people need to know more. And I'd like to break down this world and show people what I was doing and help, explain this world to people. And so why not? Let me give it a go. Let me give it a shot. And, one season turned into 18. So, I ended up doing it for pretty much a generation and over a decade. So yeah, it was quite something.
Yeah. So just talking about that, I mean, once again, the show just grows with popularity. So, talk about the beginning stages of that, because it was a new idea. It was a new type of a show, but by the, later seasons of it that you had been doing, I mean, it was a household item for pretty much everybody. So talk a little bit about just even maybe the way people in the industry looked at the show, if maybe that changed over time, or their perception of you, facilitating on that type of show changed.
Well, as I mentioned, I was on for 18 seasons. And so that is literally not 18 years, because we did one season at the beginning, we ended up doing 2 seasons a year. So, but it spanned almost 11 years that I was on the show. So literally an entire generation grew up with this show on television talking about fashion and modeling and what have you, and photography. And for many people, it was the very first time they'd seen anything like it, and certainly got a good taste of the behind the scenes. And for all those people who never thought they were worthy of Vogue, all of a sudden, they were listening to experts from fashion and what have you. And when we first got started, as we were a new show and it was quite commercial and we were on a small network, our sponsors were very small, and our sponsors were also quite commercial. So even when the sponsors got bigger, they ended up being sponsors that perhaps aren't high fashion or even really fashion at all, but really more sort of chains and big stores like Walmart and what have you. And which were fantastic because they really supported and got the show going. And they also understood mass, which is what television is. TV is not for some small little audience, but TV is for trying to get millions of people to watch something.
Yes.
That's the model of television. So it's, they understood that, and that was their model too, right? So what we were trying to do is get high fashion, which is not for the masses. High fashion is for a very small amount of people, but explain it to people. So that was our dichotomy. But by doing that, what we did was able to get some of these bigger brands and then combine them with these more luxury brands, and there was a payoff for both sides. The luxury got to perhaps be more well known and spin off, and the big mass brands got to be considered a bit more luxury and high end by association. So there was a payoff for both sides that we kind of figured out in our format, and it really was pretty game changing. This was pre-social media. There was no social media, no Facebook, no Instagram, no Twitter, nothing. MySpace wasn't even around when we started it, right? So this was really early days. And I remember when Twitter first started, and I remember when Tyra was on it, and she was like talking to us and said, "Look, I've got 40,000 followers. Can you imagine? 40,000 people are following me." Like that was some crazy big number. And we were all like, "My God, 40,000 people! Like, what does that even mean? Like, what are they doing?" And so now I'm sure she's probably got 40 million followers. But it's sort of one of those things where the world was very different. And in many respects, I think that reality television was a precursor to social media. It showed people en masse that people like to see behind the scenes. They like to see the making of. They like to see the sort of authentic realness and not just the polished finish. And a lot of magazines mistakenly made the mistake of assuming that everyone just wanted to see models in the final product. And whereas sort of the Vogues of this world didn't take shows like Top Model very seriously initially, it took them about 10 seasons before they realized, when our numbers were incredibly high, we were sort of #1 rated show on prime time on a Wednesday evening, and we were syndicated. So we were we were being viewed in over 53 countries with our American version, and the format was in 150 countries around the world, with a global audience of over 100 million people tuning into Top Model every week. We were a huge television sort of behemoth at that point. And of course, then Vogue was like, "Oh, we want in." So ironically, Vogue got in when we were not really in Vogue, but when we were sort of coming out of Vogue, because but they missed that sort of bucket. But we were delighted because we were like, "Oh my God, now we're all actually in Vogue." And so Italian Vogue became the magazine sponsor. Andre Leontali, editor-at-large of American Vogue, became a judge. And we got these, major people to be on the show. And it was sort of midway, 10 seasons deep that happened. So it was, quite game-changing, really, all round. And, they were a little late to the party at Vogue. But, that being said, it was fine for us. And, we loved having them on.
Absolutely. So as you're going through, once again, the show's growing with an immense amount of popularity, and there just becomes a time where it's parting of ways. So talk a little bit about just getting over that. And I think, once again, a person listening might be an ex-athlete, right? And there's a part of you that I think we tie a piece of who we are, our identity, to the things that we've accomplished. And so all of a sudden, when we have a shift in what the normal has been, sometimes it's tough to be like, well, did I lose a part of me, or how do I cope with that? So talk a little bit about that season of life for you there.
Yeah, it's like so many things. Life is got full of chapters, and when one thing ends, another begins. And I was also got married during this time. I was also having children during this time, and I had 2 kids by this point, so my life was radically different. One of the things I always managed to do was lead a very separate life to the show. So a lot of the characters on the show got very wrapped up in all aspects of the show, and it was their life. It was never really my full life, and I managed to separate it quite carefully, so that I led a very separate life. And I was also never put my camera down, so I wasn't like all of a sudden I'm now a television personality and that's what I do. I was a photographer who happened to be on television, and so it was very different, what that felt like, what that looked like. And I was always continuing to do, shoots for magazines, for campaigns, and I was doing other stuff. So when it obviously came around in season 18, after season 18, season 19, they did not renew my contract, and they said, look, we've had you for 18 seasons, you've been amazing, but we're going in a different way. Although it was very hard and kind of slightly heartbreaking, because we were like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Or what's this going to look like? I quickly sort of turned around and sort of put the word out to people, and I actually threw a party. I threw a big party at Soho House in New York, and I announced it to the audience that I had been basically removed from my job as a thing. And I think a lot of people were like, huh? Like, what? Right. But within 1 week of that happening, The Face, a new show on Oxygen, which was on NBC, that it was hosted, I was hosted by me actually in the end, but the star was Naomi Campbell. It was a new fashion show, and they were looking for someone to host it. They came to me and said, would I be interested in hosting it? So within a week of leaving Top Model, I got the job of hosting my own show with another supermodel, Naomi Campbell, on another network equally big, because I went from CBS, and CW to NBC and Oxygen. And it was even more lucrative than Top Model, and I got to do my own thing, and I got to do that for several years. So that was something which was, and it then made me realize, I can do this myself. I don't have to work for other people. And I started producing my own shows too. So I produced a show called The Shot on MTV, and have gone on to do other shows like Top Photographer and several other ones. And I've got a new show out right now with my wife and sister-in-law called The Chin Twins, which was on the Design Network. So I moved into television production amongst other things as well.
I love it. Yeah. Well, when you were telling that story about, we were doing a photo shoot and Naomi Campbell was there, I was like, oh, well, she's going to come back into play later on in the story. So I love it. So for you, you've also become an author, and you've been able to publish a few different books. So talk a little bit about how books came to be and what the, motive and the desire behind those were.
I think it's like so many things in life. There are things that come and go, and there are things that lay around and sit there. And one of the great things about taking photographs when you print them, because we live in a digital world and photographs often don't get printed, but when you do print them, they, and you frame them, they can often be framed forever, or they can be, they're sort of immortalized moments that are fantastic, and they're there on mantelpieces. Everyone has their wedding photograph, or their picture of them as a kid, or their picture of their grandparents, or whatever it might be. There's some major photograph in the house normally that is, something that's a permanent fixture. And a book is sort of one of those things. It's a permanent fixture, and in a world where things are so fleeting, it is rather nice to have something permanent. And my first book was a sort of how-to, and it was about, it's called The Beauty Equation, and it's about self-reflection and understanding that true beauty comes from within, and that despite how pretty you might be on the outside, if you're not really a fascinating person on the inside, then you're not really going to become amused and successful and considered to be really beautiful. Because ultimately, I believe that you find someone beautiful and you fall in love with them because of who they are, not what they look like. And what they look like, by the way, fades, and how they are on the inside grows. So it's sort of one of those things where understanding that and really focusing on that. And so I wrote a whole book about that. And to see if I have a copy of it around anywhere near me. I don't, but and then I went on to write another book, which was more of a coffee table book called Models of Influence, which has some of my own pictures, but also is a history of the modeling industry and who I believe women that were actually pivotal in changing people's opinion on beauty. And it was really a tribute to so many of the amazing women I've met in my life in the modeling industry who had done extraordinary stuff. And I sort of, in the forward, I talk about my mother and my grandmother and what they had done, and I kind of launch into these models who, in my opinion, are the true supermodels, the models who actually changed the business itself and changed our opinion of beauty, and really in that, as a result of that, made women the world over realize their worth and what have you. So it's kind of a cool book, and that went on to become a New York Times bestseller. But one of the things too was that I suddenly realized that if you put your mind to it, there's very little that one can't do if you want to do it. And so I quickly sort of thought to myself back then, after doing the first book, well, what else do I want to do? Well, what else could I do? And I had a job as a photographer shooting for a catalog that was a furniture company that was very successful, one of the biggest furniture companies in the United States, called Art Van. And I remember Mr. Van at one point saying to me, "So Nigel, what's your vision for the next season of our furniture? What should we be shooting for the catalog? What would you like to do for the cover?" and all this sort of stuff in a creative meeting. And I sort of, at that point, just threw the idea out. I said, "Well, Mr. Van, Art, if I really could do what I really wanted to do, I'd have my own furniture line." And he looked at me almost as if that was the most preposterous idea of all time, and said, he's like, "What are you talking about? I'm asking, how are you going to shoot our collections?" Yeah. And I said, I know. I said, "But you asked me what I wanted to do." And I'm like, "I wanted to do that." And I said, but then I went back to it, and I kind of just dropped it. And a year later, he called me up again, and I was working for him this whole time. And he said, "That conversation we had a year ago where you said you wanted to design your own furniture line?" And I'm like, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I've been talking about it. We want to do our own celebrity line at Art Van, and we threw it out there. And we already represent Kathy Ireland. We also already represent and have Cindy Crawford's collection of furniture. They're both models. I mean, if a model can have a furniture collection, why on earth shouldn't a photographer?" And they said, well, and I said, well, and don't forget, a photographer looks at angles, and a photographer understands texture and sees depth of field and frames the picture. I said, if you're giving a furniture collection to the model who's in my picture. How about the person who designed the picture? If I can design the picture, surely I can design the furniture. And they were like, "We love it. We would love to do this with you." And I launched my first collection of furniture with them several years ago. And ironically, but fantastically, Cindy Crawford was on hand to launch my furniture collection for me. And she gave me the biggest intro, flew out for my opening at Art Van, and introed and said, "I'd like to introduce my friend Nigel Barker, who's got an incredible collection of furniture coming out." And she did the launch for me, which was an amazing moment. And then her and I managed to do multiple openings for this store over the years and over the country. And so that was a really fun, another adventure that I did. And then it then leads on to, well, what else do you want to do? Do you want to do a podcast? Sure, I'd love to do a podcast. I have one called The Shaken and Stirred Show. Do you want to, what else could you possibly do that's in this world? Is it film production? Sure, let's produce our own shows. Let's make a documentary. Yeah. Let's shoot a feature film. Let's do other stuff. And it sounds daunting, but actually, the learning process part of it is the fun part, and it keeps you very sort of fulfilled and active and what have you. And so that really became my motivation, along with sort of philanthropic work, which ends up really being something which you can really express yourself and help the world at the same time. It's a way of really sort of digging deep, making a difference, and feeling like you're doing something that's worth it. It's not just about you personally, but about the world at large, which is far more fulfilling and gratifying. And and many of these organizations, certainly from a photography standpoint, need content to express who they are and to demonstrate who they are. And so, as a filmmaker, it was something that was very useful and very fun to do. So we got to travel the world with all kinds of organizations like the Humane Society, the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatrics AIDS Foundation, Adeo Foundation in Haiti, and create films in the Arctic, create films in Haiti after the earthquake, before the earthquake over in Haiti, to going into Tanzania and shooting film about pediatric AIDS and all kinds of extraordinary things that we got to see and do, which are completely outside of fashion, but we're storytelling. And I think that's what it leads back to. It leads back to the fact that as a creator and as an individual, we're all fascinated with the narrative. We're all fascinated about the story, and there's a story in everything. So it's a question of how you're going to tell that story. It's not a question of the medium, because the medium can change, but the
Mm.
storytelling is the powerful part. And that was, I guess, what I suddenly realized that I love to do, was to tell a story. So, you know, I've done everything from make skateboards with Shot NYC, to have my own fragrances with Demeter, to create my own photo booth, you know, to, you know, you name it. We've done all kinds of crazy stuff over the years. You know, I've had my own clothes, I've done my own furniture, we've done books, podcasts, shows. You know, we've kind of span the whole gamut of stuff, and we're still thinking of new things to do. So it's exciting.
You've been a pageant judge. I mean, you've done it all. You've done it all. Now, something that just, as you were kind of talking there, that just kept coming out to me though, is it seems like everything you do is focused on the other person, right? It seems like very little is, well, what can I get from this, right? I mean, you as a photographer, hey, how can I make them feel comfortable? You being on a TV show, how can I help the show be successful? You getting involved with, I know Special Olympics is a big thing that you're championing. You know, how can I help that organization out? So how do you continuously put others before yourself and serve others?
You know, my father taught me a story when I was very young, that stuck with me my entire life.
Yeah.
There's only one difference between hell and heaven. And I'm like, well, you know, I was like, well, what is that? He's like, well, you go to hell and you see a table and it's full of all the most amazing food on the planet. It's the most incredible array of the most delicious things. Yeah. And he said, there's all these people sitting around it and they're all starving. And he said, there's a table next door and it's heaven. And it's all the same food, all the same things, the most amazing food you can imagine. And everyone there is happy and full and enjoying life and chatting. And he said, envision this. Everyone has in their hand very, very large cutlery, massive knives and forks, huge knives and forks. He said, the problem being, he said, that in hell, everyone is so selfish that they won't feed the other person. They'll only feed themselves. And the knives and forks are so big that they can't get them in their mouth. But in heaven, everyone is taking the food and saying, can I serve you? Can I give you some food? And as a result, everyone in the table is thinking about the other person. And as a result, everyone is happy, everyone is full, and everyone is enjoying all the delicious loveliness that the table has to offer. But in hell, with all the same stuff, but when you're selfish and you think about yourself only, then you have nothing. But if you think about others, you have everything. And literally that story stuck with me from a small boy onwards. And it's, you know, ultimately the pleasure is in the giving far more than it is in the receiving. Yes. And it's a very common, you know, expression in the East and in Asia to do that. And I feel that there's so much truth in it. And even if it's selfish, at the end of the day, you know, it's an incredible thing to, when you do something for someone else, you have a kind of a right to stand up straight and walk up and feel proud. You've made a difference. You've tried. You've really tried and to help, versus just thinking about yourself. And so that's just the way I like to lead my life, and I feel better about it that way.
Absolutely. Well, Nigel, I want to say thank you so much for being on the show today and just sharing your story. As I promised at the beginning, what a fascinating human. The only promise that you have to make me is that you're going to do this again with me in, like, I don't know, as fast as you do really cool stuff, probably 12 months, but maybe I'll give you a little bit more time, 2 or 3 years from now, so we can highlight all the additional things that you've been able to accomplish.
I would love that. Thank you very much for having me on, and you know, good luck. This is a crazy time we're living in right now, everybody. And I know it's been a very, very tough couple of years for everybody, but at the same time, I think it's taught us a lot about who we are as people. And it's certainly for me in this world, it's taught me to also stop and smell the roses and realize just how lucky I am and how much magic there is right in front of us. And, you know, it always seems like other people have it better than you do. But, you know, we have to appreciate exactly what we have. And I can tell you from visiting places like, you know, Tanzania and Haiti and places where they have literally nothing and people have oftentimes less than nothing. I've seen incredible perseverance. I've seen incredible strength of character. I've seen, you know, people conquer the odds and smile and be happy with nothing at all. And that makes me realize that, you know, it's not the things in life that matter, but it's how we, you know, handle the world we are in. And it's not how you fall, but it's how you pick yourself up. So let's all pick ourselves up and make sure we put our best foot forward.